Hi, I'm Therese Bottomley, editor of the Oregonian and Oregon Live. This is Beat Check with the Oregonian. Today, I've invited longtime editor and reporter Betsy Hammond to talk about the legislative session that just wrapped up. Betsy's team covers the activities of the legislature and coordinates with reporters on other teams who track legislative bills. She also is our elections specialist and an expert in education policy and political polling. So Betsy, welcome back to Beat Check.
Thanks for having me, Therese.
So for starters, tell me a little about your history at the Oregonian and how you came to be in charge of political coverage.
Yeah, that was an unexpected move for me. I came to the Oregonian more than 25 years ago to cover education. And my interest in education inevitably meant covering some aspects of politics, both in the governor's office and in the legislature. I also happen to love math and statistics. And so over the years, I developed a side gig on election results expertise. I like to gather and analyze the results on election night as fast as possible as part of a team so that we can call results. And so that allowed me to be in one aspect of planning our elections and politics coverage. And I learned a lot working with various excellent politics reporters here. And I had no plans to become an editor. I love being a reporter, but when the previous politics editor departed, I was arm-twisted into filling the role, at least on a temporary basis. And it turned out it's actually a really great fit for me. So that's where I am today.
It is a great fit. So Oregon's legislature meets every year with longer sessions like this year's, alternating with shorter sessions. Thousands of bills are introduced each session, and we can't possibly write about them all. So tell us how you generally tackle a session and sort through all the issues.
Actually, that's varied through the years, depending somewhat on our staffing levels and how experienced our lead legislative reporters have been. But having Oregon's largest newsroom and a wide array of subject matter experts really helps us with the challenge of knowing which bills are worth writing about. We've got reporters including Maxine Bernstein, who leads us on policing and gun regulation, Gosha Wozniacka on the environment, Nicole Hayden on homelessness, Jayati Ramakrishnan on transportation. We turn to experts like that. They work their deep sources to learn which potential policies and which spending plans and are going to be the most controversial and also potentially have the greatest impact on the state. We focus on covering those. As part of the mix, we like to highlight a few lighthearted bills. Example this year was naming the potato as our state vegetable. And we focus on bills that carry the greatest political drama, which this year was definitely the standoff over the bill on reproductive and gender-related health care. But we make sure that the bills and budgets that will have the most impact on Oregonians' lives are at the center of what we cover.
So say more about that bill and the walkout over the bill. How did that create reporting challenges for your team?
Well, at this point, my team has become rather accustomed to covering walkouts, Therese. And so that wasn't a particularly large challenge, especially because this year, unlike during some past walkouts, Senate Republicans and their leaders stayed in Salem during their boycott, and they were willing to talk to our reporters. So we covered the walkout as news. We were able to find out what the key factors were that they were fighting over, but we also knew that our readers did not want a breathless day-by-day coverage of a 6-week boycott. And so we covered, we tried to stay focused on covering the content of the session. The real challenge it posed for us, frankly, was that there were so many bills that needed to pass the Senate in those last few days that it was just an absolute blizzard, and it was a lot for us to keep up with. But I thought we managed to do a noble job.
Yeah, that was a sprint to the finish. They do have that legal requirement of finishing up by a given time now, unlike years past when they might go long. So another challenge was that the Capitol, the state capitol where the legislature meets in Salem, was a construction zone, right? So what's going on there?
Oh, yes. The Capitol is undergoing extensive renovations and earthquake retrofitting. And yes, most of the building was off limits for this entire session. And noises and smells that are associated with being part of an active construction zone were very much part of all time spent in the building. But at the same time, floor sessions and committee work And most of the press conferences, all of those things are available to journalists and to the public virtually, online as well as in person. And so our reporters didn't spend a ton of time at the Capitol. And so the impact on our journalism was less so than the impact on the lawmakers and the staffers who had to be there amid all that clanging and banging day in and day out.
Well, since the media room is in the basement of the Capitol, it's probably a good thing they're getting that earthquake retrofitting done. We did have to move our office to Willamette University temporarily. But yes, the pandemic, and we found during the pandemic a lot of tools that were already in existence and some that were added to be able to cover things remotely. We have a great section on Oregon Live, gov.oregonlive.com, where citizens can follow bills and can watch testimony and watch live action from the Capitol. So there was a sprint to the finish. Not everything got done. What are the unresolved issues? What are the bills we're likely to see come back again?
Well, campaign finance for sure. Campaign finance limits was something that the governor and key Democratic lawmakers had promised repeatedly they would get done this year, and they absolutely did not. And we know it's a subject that voters are very interested in, and where there is very broad agreement in Oregon that there is far too much unregulated money in politics, and voters want sensible limits and disclosure requirements. So those topics are likely to come up in the 2024 short session, because there are multiple potential ballot measures that are teed up to potentially be on the fall 2024 ballot. Lawmakers are probably going to want to have their own shot at setting those rules rather than let it go to voters. So we'll definitely expect to see that back again next year. There's also going to be, for sure, more action related to the governor's aggressive drive to get Oregon building as many as 36,000 homes and apartments per year. I'm sure that will come back around with need for new policy changes and potential new funding streams to deal with the severe undersupply of housing in our state. And then also coming back for more money will be the need for a new bridge between Portland and Vancouver, and the planned improvements to I-205 and I-5 at the Rose Quarter. How are those going to be funded? We expect to see that back again.
So going back to campaign finance, I know our state government reporter, Hillary Baroud, with a very strong watchdog sensibility, uncovered some interesting things looking at a very large donation to the Democratic Party of Oregon. So tell me how Hillary uncovered that story.
Well, Hillary, as you noted, she is really has a specialty in campaign finance, and she watches that stuff like a hawk. But this one, we use a very simple lens when we're trying to prioritize what we're going to cover, and we look for the big bucks. And so this one really stood out. A $500,000 donation to the Democratic Party of Oregon, biggest one ever. So naturally, she took a look at that, and right away she thought, well, why is a cryptocurrency transfer fund out of Las Vegas caring about the minutia of Democratic Party politics in Oregon? That makes no sense. And so she did what any good reporter would do. She picked up the phone and called them to ask why they made the donation. They, of course, are aware that there are severe federal penalties for lying. And so they were quick to get back to us, I think, early the next week to let us know that they'd made a mistake and they were not, in fact, the donor of that money. And they coughed up the name. And from there, Hillary traced the roots, figured out who he was with FTX and the cryptocurrency connection, and she has followed it ever since then. And the saga is not over, and potentially there are going to be criminal charges brought against Mr. Singh for falsifying the source of the donation. So stay tuned.
Yeah, definitely much more to come there. Great impact by Hillary. We also saw some impact this session from our reporting on early literacy, including how districts in Oregon can and do use unproven methods to teach our kids to read. And as we know, as you know, as a longtime education reporter and editor, reading scores in Oregon have lagged. So tell me more about that.
You're right that Oregon reading scores have been low and they've been stagnant for a long time. And partly as a result of that, Governor Tina Kotek came into the session determined to drive a big change in the way Oregon elementary schools teach reading. But that plan was not fully formed at the outset of the session, and she and key lawmakers continued to refine the plans for how they would try to make improvements to reading instruction in Oregon well into the spring. And we saw that some of those changes that they made to their plans aligned with what our reporting was revealing about the underlying sources of the chronic failure to teach reading proficiently to so many young Oregonians. And we're going to intensely focus on reporting out the impacts from those grants and the associated training and materials as they roll out in schools starting next spring. Another way that we saw our coverage reflected in the policy changes for our state around literacy did not come from the legislature, but rather an executive order that the governor issued. Our higher education reporter, Sammy Edge, did a deeply reported story that showed in detail how some Oregon teacher preparation programs were continuing to teach future elementary teachers incorrect or inexpert ways to teach reading. And after her story published, Governor Kotek issued an executive order setting in motion an aggressive effort to raise the bar for how colleges of education would instill reading instruction skills. It created a 20-member panel charged with recommending new standards for elementary teacher preparation, and that's going to do so on an aggressive timeline. Those proposals will be out by December so that the legislature could enact them early in 2024.
So how is it that Oregon districts could be using these unproven methods to teach reading? I mean, how does that work that there's no oversight of the methods they're using to teach kids?
Oregon has a long tradition of local control. Oregon schools are supposed to choose books off of a selected state-recommended set of materials for any curriculum, including reading. But if a district wants to use something that's not off the approved list, it doesn't even have to get any kind of permission or have anybody check that. School boards have wide latitude to pick the methods. The other place, and this is where more of the regulations will come into play, are what teacher preparation programs are required to do by the Teacher Standards and Practices Commission, which licenses teacher prep in programs in Oregon. They do check curricula, syllabi, but they've largely taken a very hands-off approach. They haven't turned down any of these programs that were continuing to rely on methods that have been refuted by research, and that's what the governor's executive order is setting out to change quickly.
Really, really important impact from pointing out those flaws in our approach. So speaking of schools, we have a pretty neat schools database on Oregon Live, schools.oregonlive.com. Can you tell our listeners about the database? And I believe it's pretty unique in Oregon.
That's true. And all of our thanks goes to our data expert, Mark Friesen, who built and maintains and updates this system. It allows readers to find information that you probably could find buried within the depths of the Oregon Department of Education's website if you were a very sophisticated user who knows all the weird tricks of where they stash stuff. But this is much easier to use. You can look up any district or school in Oregon. It's going to show you the demographics of the school district or of the particular school, track record of graduation rates, test scores, school performance ratings, all of that key information that people want to know about their schools or potentially schools in a community they might be moving to. And yes, it's very easy to search. And we do know it's widely used, and we do hear feedback if we ever leave a school out.
So a great resource, again, for parents, schools.oregonlive.com. Lots of ways to check on how your school or the school you might be moving to the neighborhood of is performing on test scores and everything else. So with that, I'll call to wrap with Betsy Hammond, longtime political and education editor at the Oregonian. Her team covers, as we've talked about, Oregon government and politics, also City Hall of Portland, education from K through 12 to higher ed, She has a full-time homelessness reporter, lots of great stuff coming off her team. So I'd like to thank Betsy for being here today.
Thanks, Therese.
Thanks so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps people to find the show. And tell a friend. Help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.